infinite potentials, transdisciplinary collaborations. Collaborative creative practice has a long-standing history ranging from ebook creating anonymous historical works all the way to contemporary networked art projects. The advent of multimedia tools and the rapid development of information and communication technologies provided fresh ground for growth, and as a result, interdisciplinary projects escalated at an extraordinary rate in the last decades. New concepts emerged related to the identification of collaboration elements such as creativity or risk taking. Due to the redefinition of network theories, the very concept of collaboration has been revisited, and the examination of interdisciplinary complexity have found new currency. Today, creative technology, science, art, and everyday life seem to be more intimately linked than ever before. This prompts a series of questions. What exactly is a creative collaboration? How is it defined? Are there any rules? What are the ethical concerns of collaboration between science and the arts? How are the inevitable cultural differences bridged? While it is practically impossible to find answers to these and many other relevant questions, interdisciplinary residencies and summits on collaborative practice served as benchmarks for those of us who work in these fields. It is important to note that art-informed research became a feature of collaborations. A couple decades ago, the term research indicated investigations mostly limited to the field of bioscience, engineering, or economics. Today, research forms an integral part of interdisciplinary art practice, whether it's conducted within academia or at an artist residency. The transition from a wide variety of unpotentially arranged artist residencies on every continent, including the Polar Circuit events at the end of the 90s in Lapland, close to the Arctic Circle, followed by Solar Circuit, and in the Maria Island National Park, Tasmania, where 35 international media artists resided without electricity or internet, surrounded by protected wildlife, including kangaroos and snakes, led eventually to formally organize interdisciplinary events at the Banff Centre in Canada and many sites around the world. Project-based activity around art-science collaboration has become a feature of calls to action. The deliberate framing of issues and projects around art-science interactions. The Solar Circuit Aotearoa, New Zealand, for short SCANS festivals, since 2006 were conceived and presented on past editions with a major difference, namely the inclusion of Maori philosophies, practice and participation. The biannual residencies began each time at Maori community centers or marais. The events provided fertile ground for subsequent transnational collaborations. These days, interdisciplinary collaborations, especially between scientists and artists, are on the rise. David Bohm, the visionary quantum theorist, was an early proponent fostering the notion of the creative impulse in the science and the arts. He maintained that creativity is fundamental to human experience and predicted that someday science and art will merge. He wrote, "Creativity is, in my view, impossible to define in words. The scientist emphasizes the aspect of discovering oneness and totality in nature. For this reason, the fact that his work can also be creative is often overlooked." David Bohm persistently challenged established notions concerning the nature of reality and the order of the universe, and brought the concept of wholeness to the attention of the contemporary scientific world in 1980 with the publication of Wholeness and the Implicate Order. He proclaimed that science never fully explains the world. Thus, he investigated spirituality, a context that receives different interpretations to this day. From time immemorial, in contrast to conventional compartmentalized Western worldviews, indigenous cultures across the world focus on a holistic understanding of nature based on thousands of years of traditional experience. These concepts form an integral part of indigenous philosophy, including the notions that everything is connected to everything else. Everything is in a state of constant change, and this change occurs in cycles or patterns. Gary Witherspoon, anthropologist, observed how in the Navajo universe each element moves continuously in an interrelated mode. The underlying assumption is that nothing is totally inactive in the universe. The cosmos is composed of interconnected processes. In this world of motion, the perspective of movement dominates and pervades the classification of the world. The indigenous world is essentially dynamic, unsuited for segmenting. Accordingly, the indigenous, in this case Navajo perspective, is a cosmos composed of process and events, as opposed to a cosmos composed of facts and things. Living in balance with nature is a fundamental tenet of indigenous people. Thus, concerns about shifting patterns in nature, for example, climate change, disrupts the sense of interconnectedness, a deep spiritual part of everyday life. To appreciate and accept the world of interconnectedness might be a useful exercise in these times of the COVID-19 pandemic.
We have many indicators of a climate crisis. The average world temperature is rising. According to the IPCC, within the next 12 years, it is essential not to exceed an increase of 1.5 Celsius degrees, considered by the scientists as the limit to avoid the threat of the tipping points for human and non-human systems. Our project Art Science, Art and Climate Change, started in 2018, has activated a 3-year research program with conferences and exhibitions where art and science collaborate to imagine the future. Cultural institutions, scientists, artists, researchers are asked for focusing together on the environment transformations and on their geographical, ecological, economic and cultural consequences. Until now, 4 events have been organized in Italian cities. In Cervia, the topic was the sea level rising and impact. In Rome, it was the relevance of data and climate study and research. In Urbino, at the Fine Arts Academy, a long week of conferences and workshops with the students. The topic was a possible role of the communities in the climate emergency, and in Bologna it was a role that the fear can play in the climate crisis. Environment, animal and vegetal life and human activities are intimately interconnected, requiring the collaboration of scientific discipline and humanities, including the knowledge base of indigenous and ethnic minorities. Therefore, a transdisciplinary approach to overcome the distance that often exists among different disciplines is needed, a constructive synthesis that goes beyond the mere collaboration. The concept of transdisciplinarity was introduced by Jean Piaget in 1970, and recently its meaning has been discussed in the field of science by Bernard Choi and Anita Peck, who confronted it with concepts like multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, whose meaning is often considered as analog or interchangeable. A main issue related to climate change is the rise of the sea level. This implies a dramatic transformation of the environment, flora, fauna, and human local life conditions. The first Earth Science event was held on this topic in Cervia, Italy, a coastal town in the northern Adriatic Sea, where researchers report that by 2100 the sea could rise up to 1.5 meters. The event in Cervia was entitled From the Mediterranean to the Pacific, Dialogue Across the Seas, and was made in conjunction with Vital Transformations, a series of events on art and climate change taking place in New Plymouth, New Zealand. Italy and New Zealand are almost geographically in opposition on Earth, but they are ideally connected by the seas because they both vastly rely on their sea environments. Therefore, an ideal bridge was built between geographically distant places, a dialogue between different cultures on the common topic of the sea and climate that is global and local at the same time. In order to preserve on Earth the climate situation that for millennia supported humans from their descent to the current pervasiveness, it should be mandatory to act resolutely, globally and univocally towards common and shared goals, which involve politics, economy, and more in depth the human culture up to the behavior of the single individuals. A reflection about time is needed on the gap between the typically human ability of imagining the future and the urgency to contrast the climate crisis. As human, we are able to project ourselves into a future that concerns and includes our lives. We continuously do it. But the challenge of the climate crisis requires a perspective able to go beyond the generations into an extended and intergenerational time that overcomes the biological lifetime of many in a constant, coordinated, cooperative and selfless planning and action projected into a long-term future. A commitment that unfolds with great uncertainty in an event horizon where many will not be there. The Anthropocene imposes a reflection about the time span of the human species and cultures in contrast to that of the individuals, requires a vision extended to a remote future that should be governed knowing that people will not be part of it. This implies a cognitive leap, a different consideration of humanity and its relationship with the non-human and the environment, intended as a complex dynamic intercourse towards a further level of awareness in a new pact with the existing. In the Anthropocene, humanity must go beyond itself, beyond what largely has been its nature and culture, from its rising to its questionable success on Earth. Assuming that all this can be possible, it will not be a painless process.
Haere mai nau mai, tēnā koutou katoa, Watawai Iori and Konnichiwa. I'm Ian Clothier, an 8th generation descendant of the island of Hiti Orewa. I'm going to be picking up on some of the points that Pierre Luigi just made, in particular related to interdisciplinarity and multicultural activity. The first point I want to make is that the holistic understanding that indigenous cultures have is based on thousands of years of traditional experience, and it's important that we academics acknowledge this. And of course we have Also heard Nina mention David Bohm, who had ideas around wholeness and implicate order. This holistic understanding that indigenous does have correlates in Western thought and science. Integrated systems, chaos and complexity, post-structural philosophy, all are pointers to interconnection. And indeed the notion of the sentient non-human has been a part of indigenous understanding for millennia. I'd now like to talk about three ISEA projects where culture was really intersected. In 2004, I led a project that aimed to connect both local ethnicities and hybrid Polynesian cultures via the writing of the Constitution of Laestavia, which was an artist micronation. So the Laestavian Constitution had elements of the Estonian Constitution, recently written at that time, components of the 1838 laws of Pitcairn Island, which gave all over 15 the vote. Hiti or Rava is the Tahitian name for Pitcairn Island. Anyway, an online voting process occurred and that identified that meritocracy would be the political system, not democracy, and that ecologically sustainable values would drive the economy with 61% of their votes rather than cash based on gold. So ISEA 2006, the project was interrogating the invisible. I used an online form which gathered information about a person's sense of cultural identity. 85% of people indicated having more than one sense of cultural identity. And what became really prominent to contemporary cultural identity is friends and social group. Then in 2009, I led a project where 4 dates that were instances where Ireland was connected could be voted for online. And the date August 10th, 1976 received the most votes and was entered into the history of Laestavia. That date was the day of a tragedy that led to the establishment of the Peace People organisation. So these 3 projects really see culture as dynamic, intersecting, and having non-linear outcomes. I'd now like to discuss a project in Aotearoa, New Zealand, SCANS, which is a residency workshop, has exhibitions and hui or symposia, mainly every 2 years, and increasingly occupying public space. This is a project that is a cultural partnership with Te Matahiapo Indigenous Research Organisation. Now, the reason we engaged in this relationship, or we wanted to engage with Indigenous peoples, was that we did see that the solution to climate change entailed involving the voice of Indigenous peoples. Now, that is something that is an alteration of the Western sentient mind, but it is, in my view, a key driver to the current condition of knowledge. SCANS 2015, to take just one example of a SCANS, had representation by several Indigenous groups, including Inuit. Thanks very much to the Nunavut government. Some of the events were held at Parihaka, which has led to developing further projects with Mata Wharehoka, who is an elder there. Water Peace Power 2016 saw Lee Uakum of the Yoriora people collaborating with Tracy Benson, and these events have actually led to ongoing Nunavut Māori collaboration. and as well now has folded in low emissions technology. This is Marta Whare Holker standing outside her meeting house, and this is a solar powered PO. When it's activated, it plays the history of the meeting house. Scans 2018 was entirely at Parihaka. Among things that happened, Nina Sigledi arranged for Roger Molina to Skype into the marae, leading to an entangled space of culture and idea. And actually we've had Indigenous keynotes and Western since 2011. But in 2018 it really became intergenerational with electronic workshops for Māori school children. Also in that same year though, in 2018, we collaborated with Severe as part of the Art, Science and Environment project. These are three of the main people in Te Matahiopole. That is Dr. Waikiri Puru in the middle there. He led us through the project for ISEA 2011. It was called Te Kore Rongo Hunga Ora, which means the potentiality, the group of people who seek balance in nature. It incorporated a chart of Te Tao Māori, the Māori universe, written by Dr. Waikiri Puru. It was a significant project with Te Matahiopole, and some people in the installation period joked about, whether I was building a marae. ISEA 2012, the Māori concept of wai, which means water or flow, dictated the selected and projects. Prompted by Dr. Waikiri Puru, we achieved the involvement of local indigenous Dine Navajo in terms of ceremony and also as artists. And very much nature, technology and culture became entangled in that project. I would like to just highlight on the subject of ISEA that the ISEA 2015 Education Forum was a pinnacle of Indigenous engagement led by Nina Sigledi following a long sequence of important ISEA events. At ISEA 2019 I exhibited two projects. One an art science work, one developed from a contemporary Māori painting. And now with this current project, I'm aiming to integrate the Indigenous voice, the human, with the nano level of science. So I scan data images, build a soundtrack, and create generative video out of that. And this is clearly an experiment in integrating entanglement, the human, the nano, and the universal. I'd just like to conclude with a few remarks around engaging with Indigenous. If you wish to do that, involve discussions early in the framing of projects before decisions have been made. Approach honestly, learn about Indigenous in the place you're working or showing. And certainly there is a message from Indigenous to the West, and that is that we must co-evolve with our environment, giving us a new sense of local. Thank you very much, and I now hand over to Roberta.
The ocean that keeps us apart also joins us. In the summer of 2018, we met for art science in the city of Cervia, a popular seaside destination with an interesting history located on the northeast coast of Italy. The city is crossed by a canal connecting the sea to a small-sized salt reservoir called the Saline, which doubles as a conservation site and a major tourist attraction. In attempting to make a long-distance collaboration with New Zealand, we reflected on the differences between our cultures, especially when one thinks of the tourism of the northeast coast of Italy compared to the different environments that you can find in New Zealand. This is a region that struggles to maintain its rural and maritime tradition in the face of rampant club culture, consumerism, and entertainment. What really joins us is a need to really develop a holistic approach that bridges and finds a balance between economy and ecology, two terms that the West has increasingly understood as separate. To establish or re-establish this balance, we must recuperate a view of the territory that is somehow new, because it goes against the usual sectorial views, but also very old, because it spans thousands of years. The people living in this region lived by tending the land while remaining connected to the sea. This tradition survived many centuries and many regimes, from the Byzantine Empire to the Republic of Venice, to the papacy, to the fascist era, to the current declining capitalist republic. This battle occurs today as the fate of the territory is being discussed at this very moment between developers and conservationists after a tornado damaged part of the forest. The sea, the Pineta, that is an extensive conifer forest belt spanning along the coast, and Le Saline, so the salt flats, are three iconic areas surrounding Cervia. Together, they form a microclimate that protects the territory from storms and harsh weather. Tourism and industrial development have put this area at risk, and yet tourism is a major force and a major source of wealth. It is complicated. Salt is a common and simultaneously precious substance, essential to the growth of life, yet able to destroy life. It is both symbol of economic wealth and a cause for environmental decline. Salt is the perfect pharmacon. When skillfully used, it produces divine culinary experiences. When abused, it causes disgust. In Cervia, salt is the symbol of a delicate balance between conservation and tourism. That is, it stands at the cusp between the desire to preserve a fragile and rich natural territory, the Saline, la Pineta, the sea, and its surroundings, and the need to manage its tourism. The latter, if let go wild, can be a threat, but it can also act as an incredible incentive to its preservation. Le Saline thrived thanks to the labor of the salinari, some local people who traditionally worked every spring and summer to extract salt from the pools of the salt flat. The preservation of this tradition, even if mostly maintained as an attraction, has made sure that the salt flats and the luscious natural reserve that accompanies it was preserved. Remembering the tradition of the salt collectors is actually very important. It is not just entertainment, but also a labor of love, bringing back the ephemeral memory of a past long gone, which is threatened to be forgotten. Following a self-directed residency at the Salt Flats, I collaborated with interdisciplinary Canadian artist Elaine Whittaker, and this was another collaboration across the ocean, just the other way around. We collaborated to create a sound installation. Sounds were collected during field work as well as during strolls on the beach and the city. The installation consists of a fish tank, symbol of the microclimate, containing a series of objects covered in salt. Salt encrusts and corrodes, embellishes and engulfs bones and feathers of birds and remnants of other animals, leaves, sand and stones from the forest and the seashore, industrial waste and commercial items used by kids playing on the beach. These objects tell a story when a sensor is hand-activated. Together, they narrate the territory as a complex ecosystem. Le saline and the microclimate that formed throughout centuries were moved and transformed, reduced and enhanced, thanks to the action and the passing of humans and non-humans, the growth and collapse of economies, and the mutation in the environment. For those who want to listen, the objects comprising this installation reflect the contradictions as well as the entanglements that make up the ecologies of Cervia. The installation points to the need to put aside current divisions and consider the role that an ecological view from oikos, house, dwelling space, habitation, can contribute to the formation of new dialogues, new ideas for economic thriving, and the preservation of a meaningful historical memory. Thank you.
What does engaging language in post-ecology scenarios mean? How does language affect climate? Language, in any form, oral, written, genetic, algorithmic, has the power to materialize the world. If it is true that we have entered a new era and everything suggests that this is what it's all about, the urgency of finding new words and reattributing new meanings to all terms is now a matter of fact. Critical theory, science, and art can play a remarkable role in the shaping of the future. Art has in fact the great power of entering the spaces in between language and the world it is shaped from. It awakens consciousness by employing language in alternative ways. Let's go back for a moment to the question of language. A variety of terms have been used in science. Many of them have changed meaning over time. We name just a few. At the end of the 19th century, the Swedish Nobel physicist Svante Arrhenius theorized a possible overheating of the Earth due to the rising of CO2 levels. It is interesting to note that back then, the expression greenhouse effects, was understood in a positive sense to indicate a climate favorable to agriculture. In the 80s, however, this expression became synonymous with overheating caused by human intervention, only to be replaced in the 90s by global warming, and finally by climate change. In 2010, in his text, The Ecological Thought, Timothy Morton remarked the importance of language to materialize the world. It was at this time and within this text that he coined the term hyperobjects to refer to things such as black holes, solar system, biosphere that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. His ecological approach was entirely founded on language. His vision was a transversal one. The dualism subject-object was shifting toward the dualism subjectivity-intersubjectivity. This explains in which way his objects are hyper in relation to some other entity, whether they're directly manufactured by humans or not. Then appeared the word Cthulhucene, recently coined by Donna Haraway. Cthulhu, from the Greek kton, a term that translates the word earth, referring to what belongs to underneath, and chthonic, corresponding to the English adjective underground, also referring to underneath Greek deities. Again, it is more than a new term. It enhances a new vision projected into a tentacular thinking, as she says. This very much attunes to the asymmetric age as described by Timothy Morton as the age we are moving to. Asymmetry is also reflected in the reconfiguration of the internet at the time of the blockchain. Novacene is the term proposed by James Lovelock to point at the new era born from the collaboration between human and machine. He envisioned the potential of the bit as a primarily an engineering term, the tiniest thing from which all else is constructed. This vision embeds the importance of the language of code, suggesting that information may indeed be the basis of the cosmos. These are just a few of many terms that are currently emerging. They are not just terms. They are ways of defining the world and of attuning to these major changes. The usage of terms combined with mass media communication is then reflected into human behavior that in turn affects climate. How does art engage with language and with the language of science? How is it able to slip in the in-between spaces from where to reveal the world under different perspectives? Art implies an alternative use of language that can be equally powerful, whereas it strives to attuning to life and science. Andrea Polli, for instance, has produced a number of projects, translating climate data into sound or audiovisual installations. In other words, she has created narratives that enable the studying of phenomena in their process. At the same time, she has provided consciousness of different stages of data production and translation before they address to the public in the form of language, a language that materializes phenomena as objective, mostly when it comes to science that talks about climate. With this long-term project Ariocene, artist Soma Saracino has materialized air as a space in between, a space that embraces us like an embryo. We can perceive it at the moment we inhabit it and the moment we float on it. We are diving deep into the perception of Morton's hyper-objects. In this dimension of multiple centers, of transversal thinking and of interrelation of the whole, in the echoing of the local on a global scale, converge all the aforementioned projects and thinking of this panel. The infinite potentials and transdisciplinary collaborations emerged in Nina Zegledi's talk and vision, merging with the one of Yann Cloutier in their shared project at the Scans Festival. Here, indigenous Maori philosophies extended their voices and culture on a global scale. Local and global returned in arts and art science, art and climate change project in Serbia, organized by Pierluigi Capucci and Roberta Buiani. Here, the complex system of climate was discussed across the ocean, between Italy and New Zealand. Local and global and interconnection of the whole emerged again in the project that Roberta Buiani realized in collaboration with artist Hélène Whittaker. Local climate and tradition of Cervia and the global consumerist attraction it represents converged, emerged in the dualistic power of salt, of preserving and corroding. In Cervia, within Art Science Conference in 2018, was where this whole discussion about language has started. Now, collaborations that revolved around the Scans Festival and the ones that met in Cervia are merging in a new and rich path that another time crosses the ocean. The oceans that keeps us apart also joins us. The process of construction of this very same panel is a process of collaboration that expects to grow and evolve in a continuous urge of framing and reframing collaboration, of echoing local culture and practice on a global scale, of reshaping language, thus ecological thought. All these are conditions that contribute to the redefinition of contemporary sentience, and they need to undergo to a continuous renegotiation, as we hope it will happen now that results of all these collaborations will be open to further discussion. Thank you.
For that video compilation. I am Pat Badani, and I'm delighted and honored to be the moderator for this presentation. The ocean that keeps us apart also joins us. But I'd also like to begin by thanking ISEA 2020 host City Montreal and the amazing team that has worked so very hard in getting the first 100% online ISEA symposium and exhibition. It's been an incredible journey, and I'm so glad to see everything coming together. So now I want to take about 5 minutes to synthesize and present the panel members, and I will start with Nina Sigledi. I'm not going to go through their bios because those bios, if you don't know the presenters, are in the portal. So Nina Sigledi, this is a synthesis of her presentation. She contributed ideas about transdisciplinary art science collaborations and the relationship to the rapid development of networked communication. She raises questions about how to define creative collaborations marked by complexity and risk-taking. She questions what are the guiding rules, what are the ethical concerns, and how to bridge cultural differences, all very important to collaborations. She goes on to talk about institutions and organizations that have provided benchmarks for those working in art science research activities and promotes the need to sustain notions of interconnectedness and a holistic perspective, especially in light of new relationships with ecosystems in times of climate crises. Pierluigi Capucci discusses the project Art Science, initiated in 2018 in Italy. This is a 3-year research program with conferences and exhibitions and a mandate to imagine the future considering the vast array of disruptions provoked by climate change. Capucci emphasized that the need for interconnected research that incorporates indigenous knowledge in a transdisciplinary way. He goes on to discuss the evolving meaning of transdisciplinarity since the 70s to the present. Topics covered during the art science research conferences and exhibitions were, for example, the role of the community facing climate emergencies, and also the problem of the rising sea levels that created dialogues across the seas in some of the projects that have been discussed, specifically between Italy and New Zealand. Those projects address both local and global perspectives. So in tandem with evolving relationships with the non-human and the environment, Capucci poses a very challenging question. How to imagine a future where a human species may not be part of that future. Going on to Ian Cloutier, he presents interdisciplinarity and multicultural activity incorporating indigenous knowledge and holistic systems that have integrated the sentient non-human for millennia. He discusses projects produced and shown during ISEA since 2004 to the present, in which we build bridges between local ethnicities and translocal ones, with research projects exploring entanglements between the human, the nano, at the nano level of science, and the universal. These projects draw attention to political, social, and economic frameworks that are dynamic, intersecting, and have no linear outcomes. Cloutier also discusses SCANS, a festival that since 2005 investigates solutions to climate change that involve indigenous peoples' views. In 2015, the festival focused on the subject of water and peace, and has since been an intercultural and intergenerational project seeking a balance with nature. Roberta Buani discussed a research project about salt in a maritime Italian city with centuries-old traditions. The city's famous salt reservoir doubles as a major conservation site and a tourist attraction. In collaboration across the ocean with New Zealand, Guani developed a project exploring similarities and differences between cultures using water and the sea as a connective thread. She discussed the need to integrate a holistic approach that balances economy and ecology, a view that takes into consideration issues of local conservation and preservation and ecology. A view that takes up, sorry, missed my point here. So this research spawned a very interesting sound installation that you just saw in the video, representing a complex ecosystem and the mutation of environments. So the ocean that keeps us apart also joins us, presents us with collaborative projects connected across territories to explore climate change. Water and the sea provide a connective thread to survey evolving definitions of sentience in transdisciplinary ecological thinking and doing. And I have to mention Elena's presentation, which I don't have a synthesis of, but Elena discusses the importance of language to describe ecological phenomena and how this language, these definitions, have evolved with ideas historically to the present. So with that synthesis, I'd like to open a period of discussion that could be about 40 minutes, so we have plenty of time. And I have some questions. The first one was for Pierluigi, so he's not here, so I'm going to present it to the last. And I'm going to give the floor to Elena because I haven't synthesized your contribution.
Yeah.
So could you please generate the first question and first comments?
Yes, I think that I raised issues about something we have under our eyes and ears, which is language. And it is how do we talk about climate? How do we speak climate? But I think that the question of language emerged in each discussion and in each presentation of this panel, because emerged in Nina's panel, in Ian's, and even when we talk about language, we talk about ethics, no? And I probably would bounce the question to the artist Nina, Ian, who also worked with collaboration among such a different cultures, no? What does to confront among these cultures means to communicate? I don't think it's as easy as it looks like, is it?
Would anybody like to continue on that? Ian, perhaps?
Yes, no, yes, certainly it is an extremely difficult boundary between cultures, primarily because all of the knowledge systems are frameworked in different ways, and it can be very very frustrating. I have this story which kind of explains this the differences between a kind of Western European view and the Maori view. And that is, there is an organization based in the States that's called Peace Paper. And what they do is they go around to orphanages where there has been civil war. Of course, there's quite a bit of distress for the orphans who have generally lost parents due to the fighting. But they use the process of making paper as a means to sort of explore and create and to deal with and acknowledge their pain and anguish, and to have fun and be creative as well. And so I knew somebody in Turkey who was hosting this American organization Peace Paper to go to one of the orphanages he was associated with, and he knew that Parihaka, the place where we've done a number of projects, Nina and I, he knew that they were world renowned for peace, so he asked if we could get some flax and send it to Turkey so that it could be converted into paper by this peace paper organization working with orphans. Now, of course, that sounds like a perfect match to the Western mindset. And so I went out to Parihaka, and at a time I could speak to all of the community, and I presented the idea, and there were some weavers sitting in the audience, and they said, "Oh, you want us to split up the family?" And so what they meant by that was that when they see a clump of flax, they're actually literally seeing a family. They never take the center out of it. They always, take the ones around so that that family cluster is always there. And then this experience, it really highlights one of the comments that I made, which was that it's best not to approach indigenous people with the concept all settled as one thing. But it is difficult, but in my view, it is necessary. In many ways, Western thinking is being driven towards an interconnection, right? But we must engage with Indigenous to get around these issues of the environment that we're currently facing. So it's hard, but it's worthwhile.
Yes. Nina, yes?
I have to say that beyond different countries and different languages, we have different languages in our profession. So this was quite a problem in the beginning of the art and science collaboration, because people who are trained in, medicine, they have a little different emphasis on certain terms, which are not necessarily understood by some other people who come from design or something. So now I think it is getting better, this situation. But nevertheless, we have to keep it in mind that this exists. There is a different background, a different training, a different professional training. So maybe we have to pay attention.
Back to the question of language, Elena, would you like to add a little bit more about the notion of transdisciplinarity, language, and holistic visions?
Yeah, because we talk about terms, and terms can rebound also into collaboration and how people get together by working. And when I in my presentation I focused a lot on terms because terms are focused on the larger, let's say, ecosystem. No, when we talk about Morton talks about hyper objects. He talks about something that interrelates with the whole system, and so do other terms that belong to our day-to-day life. And I think it's very interesting, the confrontation with indigenous cultures, because I imagine, but Nina and Ian and maybe Roberta has a greater experience on this. They have much deeper contact with the earth, and this it is also expressed into language and in its changeable meaning. Mm-hmm. And all this discussion actually has started in Serbia, and in the event organized by Pierluigi and Roberta, and that was really interesting because this whole discussion, even from the abstract to the practical one, started in a territory where this discourse about local and global, it's really practical, it's tangible. Can I say tangible? Because it's a touristic place, but it's also very, very local. And what it makes it touristic is is the characteristic of salt. Salts, making salt extracting with all this incredible expression that salt has, and that has very much well expressed in her work in a sort of an empathical way.
Maybe I can.
Yes. Oh.
No, okay.
Yeah, Roberta, perhaps. Roberta, yes.
Yes, sure.
I just wanted to briefly address the issue of language as well, because this was something that I was faced when I did my residency in Czechia. Like, I'm originally from that region, but I've been here in Canada for like 20 years. And going back there, and after having had experience here in Canada, I became much more aware of the lost culture of the land that some people were actually trying to recuperate, and the big clash that not only linguistically but also like materially is represented by economy and ecology, which are two very much connected words, and they actually share the same etymology, but they are they cannot be more separated in the current climate. And the struggle that I saw was to actually try to conciliate the two terms and the two practices. And in doing so, the attempt was to go back to the land and really like rooting oneself down again into the land, and like recuperating the tradition of tending to the land and like having a contact to the land.
Ian, you were going to add to that?
Yes, the thing is, that there was firstly the comment around the depth of relationship that Indigenous people have, and it's just been touched on now. And then it sort of struck me when we were talking about terms that it's really kind of true in lots of ways. The West is searching for terms to meet the awareness that's increasing around interconnection. Whereas for Indigenous people, it's kind of flowed through the language for quite some time. And as has just been pointed out, what's very interesting about it is that in terms of local is that most Indigenous peoples are actually, the belief systems are related to the local area in which they live and dwell, and that's the root of and the cause and the sustenance of their connection, is this idea of locality. And then this is something that we in the West need. We've built multi-story buildings and we've put concrete over the ground and everything else. We now need to go back and to be smart and to reconnect with our environments, and there are many ways to do that. One of the things that I do hope to do as the future comes on is to bring more of these Indigenous concepts and ways of thinking to forums such as ISEA, so that these can breathe some air. And then in some sense it's a little strange, because it would be better if we could always be represented by Indigenous peoples themselves. That's can be quite a tricky thing to do. But yes, the concepts, the relationship to terms and words, very much reflective of worldviews in Indigenous peoples, absolutely. And then it is good to see that that projects like what Elena was working on, with this attempt to combine or to make ecology and economy, to have them diffract or be reflected upon each other, to try and work through ways where we can come up with positive solutions to having both.
Right. Yes, Nina.
Sorry. I think what we really need to do more and more, and I have been trying my best in various ways to, number one, to get more information about local context, because there is too much generalization going on, and it's totally different if we listen or see people who operate, whether this has something to do with the pandemics, whether it's education, or their language, but they speak from their own local context, and it is and they speak up. For example, this indigenous, we call it traditional knowledge transfer in ISEA 15, 17, and in other countries too. Also in 2013, I think. In any case, ask people to speak themselves, not somebody to speak for them. But they would talk about either the ideas or the way of life, or their maybe their ambitions or their failures. And especially when we had it in 2015 in Vancouver, and Ian was there, and we did it together. We had a lot of people, but nobody was asked to have an interpretation of what these indigenous people from different countries wanted to say. They spoke for themselves, and I think we just have to carry on with this type of method or tradition in order to get a more, a deeper, and a more genuine information.
I have a question in relationship to that. I do remember not just 2015, but previously, Albuquerque as well. There was indigenous panels, and also in Australia, which was an unfortunate meeting, but also in 2017 in Manizales. So the topic has been increasingly, or I would say, sustained in ISEA. But my question is this. It seems that the institutions are becoming interested in the indigenous knowledge and those perspectives. I wonder what's the opposite view, because my concern basically is that, my question is, what's the role of the institution within this dialogue? Is the dialogue one directional or two directional, when it is usually the institution that wants to absorb that knowledge?
I always have to fight for it.
Yeah. Yes, I have to say on this point, that one of the reasons why I mentioned in my presentation that we have to acknowledge indigenous thinking where it's precedent to the West in our academic writing. And then that is because even in New Zealand, which has had some legal framework around European and Maori engagement, there's a founding document that was signed in 1840. So that has led to, quite a bit of prominence being given to Maori. Maori language, te reo, is spoken. Many words are integrated into the language. But in the academic institutions, there's roughly about 20% Maori population of New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand. Yet for universities, the average percentage, the overall average percentage of academics who are Māori is just 7%. And so there are an enormous biases in the way that knowledge is presented, and then enormous biases in the way that institutions appoint staff. I'm not sort of complaining about or pointing fingers at anybody, but something needs to be done about this. We have to do better. We need to have greater diversity. ISEA, you're right, has been receptive to the voice of Indigenous. But that is ISEA. If you go to, some of the other major festivals of fine arts, there could be none. Absolutely none. I wouldn't know. There's been some, representation at like the Venice Biennale, but as far as I know, that's probably mostly New Zealand. I don't know if there's been much else at all. It's very very problematic, and it's why I think it's great that Nina's been doing the work that she's doing. It's why she still has to fight. You still do have to fight for these things, but it is something that we have to do as part of our realization that we also are guardians of the planet and guardians of the future generations. So quite important that we do embrace these dialogues, I think.
I think that what's important also is that Westerners also learn to appreciate that research doesn't have to have the methodology of the Western mind. And I think that that's probably one of the biggest problems that Indigenous populations across the globe face, the fact that they go into institutions of knowledge to learn and present their research projects with utilizing the methodology of the West. And that's already, you have MFAs, master's degrees and PhDs coming up with already a distorted notion or a perspective towards knowledge, because they've had to learn and adapt to a Western thinking modality just in order to get that validation.
Absolutely true. I was once doing some peer review of somebody who was writing about library information systems, actually. And it was very interesting because the author was clearly Indigenous. And the first draft allowed his sense of indigeneity to flow through the work. And what that meant was, under peer review, people were pointing out issues around structure, citation. I don't know why I'm getting a echo here. Anyway, yeah, and so the paper was changed in order to accommodate academic structures, and that killed the poetic basis of it. It was quite extraordinary, and it made me think that we perhaps even need different channels to get into this area. And then also, in some ways it goes back to some of the presentations today about language as well, to now start thinking of language not in terms of new words, but of terms across the cultural border. It would be nice to see that kind of activity happening also.
Thank you. If we talk about institutions, I mean, especially universities, for example, but even high schools or middle schools, I mean, they operate, generally speaking, on a very traditional
conservative, mostly, platform. So I'm living in Toronto, and so is Roberta, who is a leader in finding out alternate ways to get across institutions. I really, honestly, the things we have done together, but what she's doing, as a, initially, and this is an uphill battle all the time. I mean, you have to confirm what I say, Roberta.
But my battle is more bureaucratic than anything else. And it's also disciplinary. When it comes to culture, and when it comes to well, it's not just indigenous people, but also like all the people of color and the Latinos. Basically, the institutions are made for white people, white men actually. Yeah. So let's say that. But yeah, like in my case, because I'm working at the intersection of art and science, most of the problems that I've had were, well, a lot of sexism, but most of it is bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is really killing things, and I think that also administrators who are genuinely willing to actually change things, they get a wall that it's like climbing a mirror or something. Like you just try, like it's a Sisyphean of some sort, and it's never ending. So yeah, I think that what you're pointing out is very important.
So piggybacking on that, and still in the topic of institutions, you have been you have been collaborating, all of you, in very interesting ways, crossing, but also creating structures for these collaborations, right? You've collaborated to create stands, so it's an organization, but it's a parallel organization, right? Roberta and Pierluigi, you have participated in a self-created residency in order to do this project. So I've got this weird anyway, so I find this fascinating because as an independent artist, scholar, and researcher, it's sometimes frustrating to carry on with projects unless you have an institutional affiliation to channel the project, right? So we all have some kind of institutional relationship, but we also operate independently. So what I find fascinating about you as individuals in a group is that you have found mechanisms, creating structures, leading independent research, and piggybacking on institutions. So can you talk about a little bit about your strategies on these strategies that combine independent research with institutional involvement?
Well, I don't.
Who are you asking?
Well, Elena, since you talked last, you begin. Okay. It's a question for each one of you.
No, it's okay. Also, because I think I also wanted to bring up these issues that probably relates also to language, because we have talking about indigenous language, we have talking about terms, language, collaboration, etc. But there is also the language of communication, which is linked to institutions, which I think is a field that nobody can avoid. No, that a sort of phagocytate also what is brought into the institutions in some terms. So I think sometimes I worked with institutions, with museums, and sometimes I notice how communication can bring content, language, and everything is contained into another direction. Not that this is bad, this is just embedded into the nature of the institution, but this is something that must be taken into account. It's like everything comes in is sort of then it flows also in a field of language that is not to say homogenized, but it is attached to communication. So it's also that field that needs to be surrounded when you want to do research and to bring some content that is that goes beyond container institutions as a container, I believe.
Yes, just on this, on Pat's question, it was very deliberate to form a new organisation around what we were attempting to do. And then when you look actually at the history of art in general, innovation has never come from the centre. It's never come from the system. Even French Impressionism actually arose in the French countryside. That's where it began. That's where the practitioners had to operate in order to survive. And then, so when we deliberately set up a new trust to facilitate the work we wanted to do, and then what this trust does is precisely sits in between organizations that have massive administrative structures in order to get the energies flowing, particularly with indigenous groups across the indigenous western border. So that was a quite a specific thing that we wanted to do, and it's very successful. Like one of our projects involved the regional council for the area, the government's weather forecasting bureau, local iwi or tribes. And then the organisations part of it, the regional council, for example, would like to work with Indigenous people, but it can't do it because it lacks the structures by which it can engage with Indigenous people. So it does need other smaller, generally, organisations to kind of stand in between to get it all going. And then, of course, the other thing is that for Māori in this country, an authority is generally a force that acts upon you in a negative way, and there are many, social and demographic measurements that point to the deleterious impact of the West on Māori. So it's quite contentious to try and bring large organisations together with tangata whenua. And that is a scenario that needs a kind of organisation that can make the cogs turn over, and then that's one of the reasons behind why Nina and I work together on these projects, but we also work together to establish and to create trust.
Nina, do you want to add to that?
Yes, well, I am very lucky. I'm really getting on in age, which is not a lucky thing. I don't.
Lucky you.
I don't think it's a really good thing to get over. But nevertheless, because I have all these years behind me, I was very lucky to meet people in many countries, and so there is this network. Some people don't know each other, and one of my roles in life is to bring them together. But I'm very independent-minded, so I work very closely together. So in this group, I worked with everybody at one time or the other, or sometimes so many years. With Ian, we worked for a long, long time with Roberta too, Elena too, and but I think. This, in my case, but I know other people like that, is to have this informal network, which is built on mutual trust. That's the most important faculty of it. And that's my strategy. It's nothing special. Everybody can do. I started from ground zero.
Great, thank you. And Roberta, going back to you, since you were labeled the bureaucratic fighter, fascinating role, also very difficult, although in Canada, I think that you do have an ear, even though it's a battle. Can you describe, since you're involved with defending ethnicities, what would be the example of some of the battles you have to fight to help these communities to have a place and a voice?
Frankly, I have never done anything like I know that there's okay, so this is like a bigger discourse, but so one of the things that I'm very proud of in our organization is that we are trying to keep it very diverse, and we try to be as inclusive as possible. So like lots of women, we don't discriminate. We have like everybody coming in, and when people are making these grand announcements about inclusivity, I'm kind of like I don't know what to say, because we've already started from the beginning. So I'm very proud that we are doing it already. So I don't know. Like it's not a question of including ethnicities. I think is including everybody, because everybody needs to have a voice. And I think that one of the big battles actually is to get some of the like hardcore hard scientists to understand that there's different types of doing science that is not necessarily like the institutional way. I'm not talking Western way. I'm talking the institutional way. And like even, for example, like including people from the maker community is a hard thing to do. So so this type of inclusivity is so including everybody and trying to have a sustained dialogue that actually gives voice to the most people and try to have a dialogue, not a discussion, is one of the main goals. But I think that Lina is very right when she talks about informal networks, because once you become an institution and once you formalize your position, then you start to having a lot of rules and you start to add in people and then like limitations start to happen. And this is something that I've seen so I've been across several universities, like the University of Toronto and New York University are big, should I say, headless monsters? Yes, I am not I'm a lecturer there, so like they are not like, you know, the nice thing about not being a tenure professor is that I can say whatever I want. But yeah, like these are big institutions that are that want to do things, but they are so atomized and so fragmented that it's very difficult to get people talking to each other. I mean, I had to get very recently permission to film. It was not even an event, to film something outdoor in the property of the University of Toronto, and the amount of documents that I had to fill in was and like repeated, because I kept repeating myself. It was like just incredible. So these kind of things are the big barriers to a lot of people.
All right, I think we've got about 2 minutes left. I had a wonderful question for Pierluigi, and I'm going to leave it with you because he made a very challenging proposition. He said, imagining the future in which humans are not part of it. So I wanted to ask him whether this is a utopian or a dystopian view that he imagines. but we won't get into that right now.
That's a $1 million question.
Well, this
really.
is it, you know. That question depends on who you ask, right? The amoeba, the tree, or a human being. But so there's much more to cover. It's a fascinating panel. Thank you, everybody, for your very thoughtful contribution.
Thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Pat, for your contribution too. That's been really great. Thanks for sharing us so well.
Thank you.
Nice
Bye,
seeing
everybody.
you all. Okay.
Bye-bye.